In this tutorial I'm going to just give you a brief overview of some of the main windows and features of Visual Studio 2010, those parts that you really need to know about when you're creating your first Visual Basic programs. This is the start screen. You actually create a new project and a new program, so when you're working in Visual Studio you're working in projects, not programs. It really doesn't make a lot of difference at this stage. You can create a new project from here, the start page, or you can create it from the file menu at the top. So let's just create a new project. This second window comes up. Now Visual Studio is a tool for creating programs. It is not Visual Basic, it is not the language itself. And in fact it's a tool that can be used to create a number of different, or programs using a number of different Microsoft languages, such as C#. Let's just stick with Windows Basic for the moment. So we're going to do Visual Basic. Lots of different applications we can create with Visual Basic. We're interested at the moment in a Windows form application, so we've got that highlighted. Down the bottom, before you go any further, it's useful to name your program, or to get the terminology right, to name your project straight off. I'm just going to call it, it defaults to Windows Application 1, not very inventive. I'm going to be even less inventive for my one and just put temp, because it's just a sample program. The location, in my case, defaults to the last location I saved a project to. In your case, if you're using this at college, you need to browse and locate your home drive. You should have a folder there where you're going to be creating your Visual Basic projects or programs. I won't go into a great deal of depth or detail about this thing called a solution, but in Basic, when you're using Visual Studio and you're creating Visual Basic systems, you can have a solution which has one or many projects. Let's keep it simple. What we'll be using for the moment, a solution and a project and a program are all one and the same thing. So let's just say for the time being our program's called temp. It's going to be saved in this folder here, and it's actually going to create a folder called temp to hold everything in there as well. Let's just press OK. And the next screen that comes up, you may have it slightly different on yours. Let me just get rid of that so it may look like as you find it. So it's got a number of panels on the Visual Studio desktop. You've got the form, which is going to be the form that you add objects to and that you're going to design. So this is going to be, if you like, the user interface to your program. On the right hand side we've got this thing called Solution Explorer. Just think of that as the moment a bit like Windows Explorer. This is the folder that going to hold your program code, and these are the files that Visual Studio has already created. Even though we haven't done anything, it's already created some programming files for us. We'll have a look at this area in a moment. What I want to bring up though is you've got the form, and on the form we want to put on some what's called controls. These controls are held in a toolbox. If I click on this toolbox and I want it to stay on screen, then I'll just click this little pin button. So instead of auto hide, it's showing. So this is a toolbox. We've got the form, and over here we've got the Solution Explorer. This window, this panel down on the right called Properties, is anything that's actually on your, if you like, the design space that you've got here. So for example, I've got the form. If I click on it, a form and anything I put on the form has got properties. Properties are things like, what's the colour of whatever I've clicked on here? Do I want to change the colour? What text font do I want to use? Size of text, style of it. Where do I want this form to appear when it runs on the user's monitor? I can change those things and many others. So for example, I've got form. I've got a default name called Form1. Now I never typed that in, so Visual Studio has created that as a default. I can actually change that and give it a more sensible name. So obviously for your programs, you give it the name of the form should be something that represents the program. I'm just doing a practice one, so I'm just going to call it my form. And you can see that the form now takes on that name. I've changed the text property over here. I've changed the text property of the form. Let's see a couple other things. So the toolbox, loads of different tools on here. Certainly in the units we're going to be covering, We're probably going to learn less than about 5% of those, but we're going to use the ones that are going to be most useful, certainly for the programs we want to create. For example, let's bring on a control. So these are called controls. I'm bringing on a control called a label. As the name suggests, it is simply a label, a piece of text that labels part of a form or provides information to the user on a part of a form. So the label's a control. It's now on my form. You can see that it's called label 1, which once again is the default name that Visual Studio has given it. I want to change the name or the text for the form, for the label. I click on the label so that I'm actually selected this label control. I go down to the properties and you can see that here in bold, label 1. So this is the properties for the control called label. I'm only going to change, once again, there's loads of properties I could change, like colour of text, size, etc. I'm just going to change the text on the label, and I'm just going to give an instruction actually. Let's say press go to start, which will make a bit more sense in a moment. I'll press enter. You can see that the label has now taken on the text for the label, the property's been changed and it now reads as that. Let's put just one other control on here. I'm going to put a button, and as you suspect, a button is something that does something. So when the user clicks on this button, we want to do something. It's a control, so because it's a control, it's going to have properties. So if we go down onto the right hand corner here, we can see that we've got button 1 is showing. So this is the properties for the button, which I've just dragged onto the form. Let's change the text for the button, because this is going to be my go button. So I'm just going to change it from the default button 1 to go. And that's it for the properties at the moment. I'm going to change, I'm going to put something behind the button next. So all I've done at the moment is create a form which itself is a control and itself has properties. When I click on it, we've dragged on a label, which is a control from the toolbox, and I've changed the text property for the label. Finally, we put on a button, which is another control, and all I've done is change the text for that to go. At the moment, our program doesn't do anything, because all we've done is create a form with a label and a button. We haven't given it any program instructions. We haven't put any Visual Basic code in. A lot of Visual Basic code has been created in the background, but not by us. And let's just do a very simple example. We'll cover it in more detail in later tutorials, but let's put some Visual Basic code. Let's make the program do something. The way to do it is I'm going to double click on the button on the form, and this window comes up, and the window is basically where my cursor is flashing here. This is where I'm put some Visual Basic code. This is where I put the instructions into the program to make it do something. And all I'm going to do is change the text for the label I've got on there. So I'm going to start typing. I know the label began with LAB, and I get a little prompt comes up, and I know it was label 1. So the name for my label is label 1, that was what's on there. And I know, and this will be covered, I'm going to do this a bit fast at the moment, it'll be covered in later tutorials. I know that there's a property of the label which is called text. Now that was the property I changed on the other screen. Here I'm changing it using program code. And all I'm going to do is say, well, that property called text, which originally had press go to start, is now going to say hello world. Very exciting. So it's just going to say hello world when my button's pressed. Nothing's changed to my design, but I've now put one line of Visual Basic code. This other code was given to me by Visual Studio, but I'm not going to change it. Let's press the play button at the top and see what the program does. Now, in the background we've got Visual Studio, but this is actually a Windows form. This is our program, and it is a program that's running, and I can minimize it like any other particular form. I can click on it to bring it back. I could actually close it, but at the moment I'm just going to run it. So it's sitting there for the user. It says press go to start. Ooh, let's press go. Oh, how exciting. So all that's happened is, and I've done that now, so the actual code has just switched from press go to start to hello world. So that was my first simple Visual Basic program and a quick overview of the main parts of the Visual Studio 2010 screen. One last thing I want to cover. Now remember, we called this, or I called this program Temp, and I said that Visual Studio 2010 would create a folder for it. So let's have a look. This was the default location I put it into, and as you can see, and I'm running this on the 12th of the 10th, you can see that it's created a folder called Temp, and if I double click on that, it can be a bit confusing because there's another folder called Temp within it. So we've got the main folder called Temp, and then within it there's another one. It's confusing, just ignore it. It basically means we can have more than one project within a solution, but for the programs that you'll be writing in this unit, the two folders are going to be the same. What is important though, when you come to find your program again, if you, let's just go back, so if you look to where you've been storing all your programs, you find the name of the program, which would be a folder, double click it, and then look for this file here, name of your program .sln, which just stands for Visual Studio Solution. And if you double click on that, it will load it up here so that you'll have your program in there. Okay, in later tutorials we're going to go through individual pieces of code and some of these panels and properties that you need to use in a bit more detail.